I'm having an existential crisis. For the past few months, I've been addicted to a decade-old game. It's a single-player game that got okay reviews back in the day and has since gotten a sequel. From what I can tell, there's no massive community centered around this game to find new strategies and techniques. So by any standard, this game is old news and not the type of release really worth talking about after 10 full years. But damn it, I just can't stop playing it, so I am gonna talk about it, try and capture why this game strikes such a chord with me, and urge you to give it a go yourself. Maybe I'll even touch upon why I think the official reviews did this game dirty. The game in question, as you've probably guessed from the title of this video, is Hyrule Warriors. At its core, this hack and slash game is a crossover between the Dynasty Warriors series and the Zelda series. Gameplay-wise, it strongly resembles mainline Dynasty Warriors games, where you, as the player, command an army and hack your way through the opposing army, killing enemy soldiers by the hundreds. Hyrule Warriors takes this concept and puts it into a Zelda universe, meaning that all the characters, costumes, songs, maps, sound effects, and even some gameplay mechanics have been either directly lifted from or inspired by the Legend of Zelda series, which is more known for its puzzle-heavy action-adventure games. And that's it. That's the game. It's simple in both concept and execution in the sense that you get exactly what you'd expect from mixing these two franchises. And yet there's more to it. It's not just a Zelda-themed coat of paint that we're looking at. Right down to every little sound and item, this game is full-blown Zelda worship. Even individual character moves reference different moments and scenes from Zelda games. I can name so much more and still scratch the surface. The UI, the menus, the ridiculous yet enjoyable story. Hyrule Warriors also does things you'd never see in Zelda proper, or really any other Nintendo game. It's as if a talented studio went rogue, made a game about a franchise they're all fans of, and then sold their souls to the devil, submitting to everlasting torment in exchange for remaining unnoticed by Nintendo's legal team. But before I get ahead of myself, let me just clarify which version of Hyrule Warriors I'm talking about, as there's more than one. The game was first released onto the Wii U console in 2014, and I played that version and its DLC quite a lot back in the day. There was also a 3DS version, Hyrule Warriors Legends, that ported all of the original content and its DLCs to the concurrent handheld console of the time, and added yet more characters, maps, modes, and other tweaks to the game. In 2018, Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition was released onto the Switch, containing all of the previous version's content and DLCs, as well as a couple of new exclusive outfits. This is the version I'll be talking about, as that's the one I've been sinking dozens of hours into recently and is, true to its title, the most complete version of the game. There's also a direct sequel, Age of Calamity, which I have not yet played and will not be talking about today. I will also mention some Japanese names and terms in this video, and although I tried my best to pronounce these in an acceptable manner, I do not speak a word of Japanese, so I can't guarantee the absence of potentially embarrassing mistakes. As a final note before we start, this is just a video I've made about an essentially random game that I'm super passionate about and want to share with you. Since it's something different from what I usually do, I feel like the algorithm might not be too kind on it. So if you like what you see, any type of engagement, such as the usual liking, subscribing and/or commenting, is especially welcome for this one. Now, let's dive into things. A crossover between Dynasty Warriors and Zelda was first proposed by Yosuke Hayashi, a development producer at Koei Tecmo, the company behind the Warriors series. Mr. Hayashi's pitch was to Eiji Aonuma, director of the Zelda franchise at Nintendo, and he proposed a Musou game based on a Nintendo franchise. Musou is a Japanese name for the Warriors games and their spin-offs, and the term has come to define Koei Tecmo's brand of hack and slash games centered around large armies. In the next section, I'll explain how this concept plays out in Hyrule Warriors. As fortune would have it, when the idea for a crossover project was proposed to him, Mr. Aonuma was playing one of these Musou games, namely One Piece Pirate Warrior, so he was open to the idea from the get-go. Initially, the game was to feature a lot more elements from the Zelda franchise, complete with dungeons and complex boss fights, but since Nintendo mogul Shigeru Miyamoto did not like this approach and wanted the game to be more of a Dynasty Warriors game with Zelda flavoring than the other way around, that's what we ended up getting. Hyrule Warriors was developed by the studios Omega Force and Team Ninja, which are both actually game development divisions of Koei Tecmo. I could not find much information on how exactly the tasks were divided between these two studios, but based on the fact that Omega Force has long been a driving force behind the Dynasty Warriors games, they must have been responsible for much of the more tactical aspects of the game, ensuring that Hyrule Warriors would actually play and feel like a Warriors title. And since Team Ninja are known for franchises such as Dead or Alive and Ninja Gaiden, it stands to reason that they were brought in for their expertise on character design. This expertise really shows in both its quality and how unlike Nintendo some of it is, but we'll get to that in due time. Hyrule Warriors was released exclusively for the Wii U in Japan in August of 2014, with the rest of the world following suit the next month. The game was successful enough to spawn a bunch of DLC packs that were released in subsequent months. These packs consisted of new characters, weapons, and challenges. In 2016, the game was ported to the 3DS. This version included all of the DLC released up until that point, as well as some new content and quality of life improvements, such as being able to quickly switch between different characters mid-battle. Both this version and the Wii U version then received even more DLC packs. The Switch port, subtitled the Definitive Edition, was released in 2018 and was a compilation of all of this content. This also included all of the improvements and additions that had up until then been exclusive to the 3DS version. So yeah, it's very much definitive, and if this is your first time experiencing the game, then the sheer amount of content thrown at you might seem a tad overwhelming. Still, it's pretty easy to gain a sense of perspective if you just take things one step at a time. But let's take a step back and ask ourselves, what is it you actually do in Hyrule Warriors? Now, maybe you've never played a Warriors title before, and since there aren't many analogs to this type of gameplay, let me help you wrap your head around it and describe an average Hyrule Warriors battle to you. You are dropped on a map that is themed after a location in one of the Zelda games. For example, the green hills surrounding Hyrule Castle or the vast wastes of the Gerudo Desert. Each of these maps has around 8 to 10 keeps that you can capture and a number of small outposts that can also change hands. At the start of the battle, these keeps will be divided between your own faction and the 1 or 2 enemy factions you'll be facing. You can capture an enemy keep by defeating a number of low-level grunts within it, after which a slightly more beefy keep boss will spawn. Defeat this boss and the keep will belong to your faction, until of course an enemy faction takes it back following the same method. Capturing keeps can come with certain benefits, such as deflating enemy morale, luring out an enemy commander, or opening up different sections of the map. As such, the battles aren't some sort of domination mode whereby you need to capture all keeps in order to win the day. Conquering territory for your faction is often a means to an end, as it can aid you in fulfilling your missions and side missions. And there are a lot of missions during each battle. The first mission will be given to you as soon as the battle starts, and that mission usually amounts to something simple like killing an enemy officer or taking a specific keep. As you play, more objectives will be given to you. Maybe the enemy is trying to plant a bomb in one of your keeps, or they are targeting one of your allies who needs to be protected. These missions can be divided between main missions and side missions. Main missions need to be completed in order to progress the overall quest and ultimately complete the map, while side missions are optional and mainly see you dealing with threats and inconveniences before moving on to launch your big attack on the enemy stronghold. These battles can last from under 10 minutes to half an hour or even more. As the battle rages, new missions are given to you constantly. It's not uncommon for you to get 3 within a minute, and it's by design that you cannot always complete all of them in time. This forces you to analyze the situation on the fly and prioritize which side missions are worth your while. Victory and defeat conditions are pretty straightforward in Hyrule Warriors. Most of the time, you win by defeating the commander of the enemy troops, and you lose by either losing your main base to the enemy, by letting one of your allies flee, or by running out of HP yourself. So as you are given missions, you will need to decide whether ignoring that mission has the risk of triggering or facilitating one of these defeat conditions, and if so, how fast that might happen. An all-out attack on your home base may result in your side losing, but if you can kill the enemy commander before your home keep flips, you won't need to waste minutes of your time running all the way back to your home base to take out all the siegers. Those decisions can lead to tense situations where you're desperately chipping away at the enemy commander's health as you're getting warning notifications that your base is about to fall or an ally is crying for your help. There are also less pivotal choices to be made. Do you want to take out the defense specialist troops in order to make the battle against the commander easier? Do you want to bother with the summoner that keeps spawning reinforcements onto the battlefield? Do you want to chase down the item thief to get back the bow and arrow that you need in order to expose the boss's weak spot? After the combat mechanics, which I'll get to in a moment, it's this battlefield management that forms the core gameplay of Hyrule Warriors, and indeed many a Warriors game. If it seems overwhelming, it only really is at first. The more you play and familiarize yourself with the flow of the battle scenarios, the more you'll be able to determine the most efficient order in which to tackle your objectives. As you get more comfortable with your risk taking, you'll pull off more of these clutch moments where you rush into the enemy base solo and clear the commander mere seconds before your base was going to fall. When all is said and done though, most of the missions do boil down to choosing where you conduct your combat. It's almost like whack-a-mole, but you have to make a tactical decision whether you whack this mole in front of you first, or you rush to that other mole that's causing you trouble on the far end of the map. There are a lot of different ways in which to experience these battles. The default way to do so is Legends mode, the game's story mode, which can be divided into a main storyline, 2 side stories and an epilogue. Free mode is essentially the same, with the exception that you can play the missions you've beaten in Legends mode with any character you've unlocked. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the way to experience Hyrule Warriors is then to make your way through the roughly 15 hours of story content, beat the final boss, and call it a day. This would make you miss out on about 90% of the content. The real fighting starts in Adventure mode, where you make your way across a Zelda-themed map where each tile contains a different challenge. That challenge may simply be a battle like you've experienced in Legends mode, but it could also be beating a bunch of bosses in a certain amount of time, getting to a certain number of KOs, or a scenario where every hit is lethal. If you beat one of these challenges, you get a score of A, B, or C based on your performance. This score depends on factors like the time you took to complete the challenge, the amount of damage you took, and the number of enemies you've defeated. Based on this score, you can unlock rewards and progress towards the next section of tiles until you complete the entire map. It's basically a board game that has fights in every direction. This challenge board concept is not new to the Warriors franchise, as previous games sometimes featured a conquest mode, which was similar. What makes the Hyrule Warriors adventure map stand out is that it's based on a map of the very first Zelda game on the NES, so the actual OG Hyrule. If you've played that game, you can even use your knowledge of that map in Hyrule Warriors, as it can tell you where you need to use specific items to unlock additional rewards. These rewards include more powerful weapons, cooler outfits, extra heart containers for higher maximum HP, and even new characters. So if you want to be the strongest, best looking guy or gal on the battlefield, playing adventure mode is a must. The insane thing about this though is that there's not just one adventure map. The one I just described is but the first one. There are 8 more maps for you to play through, each one more difficult than the last. Most of them are themed after a specific installment in the Zelda series, such as Wind Waker and Majora's Mask, and feature additional rules inspired by those games in order to crank up the challenge and complexity. For reference, at the time of recording, I've spent about 70 hours on the Switch version of the game, during which time I've completed the Legends mode and the majority of the 2 first maps. There's still so much content for me to explore that I expect to spend a few hundred hours more to unlock all the stuff in this game. If that sounds grindy, that's because it kinda is. You see, I have a lot of MMO experience, and even though Hyrule Warriors is a solo-oriented game that doesn't have the complexity of a full-blown MMORPG, the experience of making it through dozens of challenges before you grow powerful enough to get the thing you really want does put it in the same ballpark as a gaming experience. If this idea puts you off, then sticking to the story missions and maybe the first adventure map would be advisable, provided you're okay with maybe not getting that cool outfit or character you wanted. That said, I did not mind the grind in this game at all, because I don't really see it as a grind. In an MMO, grinding tends to be a boring and repetitive side objective you do over and over in order to get something you want to use in the more fun and challenging part of the game. In Hyrule Warriors, you grind by actually just playing the game. You experience a variety of scenarios, you try out different characters, and you are rewarded for your victories near constantly. There's no RNG involved either, so you know exactly what you need to do to get what you want. And once you meet the requirements by beating that specific challenge, the outfit, weapon, or character is yours forever. The process of working your way through all these challenges does tap into this same impulse of, oh, I'll just do one more match because this reward also looks like something I'd want. But I see this as just a healthy gameplay loop that constantly rewards me for the time I spend on it, both through actual rewards and also just by giving me a good time. I've so far never exited the game feeling burned out or frustrated, which is more than I can say of my MMO endeavors. I just wanted to elaborate on this aspect of Hyrule Warriors for a bit, because once I got used to playing an MMO often, it gave me this energy to put in hours working towards a goal that I couldn't really spend in any other game until this one. That all being said, your entire experience will stand or fall with how much you enjoy the combat. So, is it any good? In Hyrule Warriors, the combat is the meat, potatoes, bread, butter, and an extra side of more potatoes. Gameplay wise, this is a Warriors game after all, so you'll find none of the puzzling or dungeon crawling from the Zelda series. Really, the only way to interact with anything in this game is to hit it or to throw or shoot something at it. So if you don't enjoy the combat, you won't like this game. It's as simple as that. The character that you play as can be seen as one of the commanders or generals of your army. Your attacks are, by design, incredibly powerful, and the game balances this by throwing hundreds or even thousands of enemies at you every battle. The grunts usually drop in a few hits, but there are several tiers above that, with each tier being able to dish out and absorb more damage. This starts with enemy captains, which are basically beefed up grunts, but with their own simple attack patterns. Then there are big monsters based on Zelda dungeon bosses that require a much more tactical approach to take down. However, the toughest enemies are typically commanders, who draw from the same pool of playable characters that you do. So it's possible for anyone ranging from Link to Princess Ruto or Impa to be your opponent in battle. How tough they really are depends on many factors, including the difficulty of the stage, as well as your own character's level and weapon. But in general, they are designed to be your equals, and beating them requires you to avoid their attacks and combos while picking the perfect time to strike back. Unlike in other Warriors games before it, in Hyrule Warriors, every enemy type above the lowly grunts and key bosses has a weak point gauge that can briefly show up after they finish a special attack or combo. Breaking this gauge allows you to do a much higher amount of damage to your foe, and learning to capitalize on these moments is the fastest way to take these opponents down. Since the top rank of enemies draws from the same pool of characters that you do as the player, they also use those characters' individual movesets, so it can take a good amount of time and experience to learn how to best fight each one of these opponents. I've found that the fastest way to get good at fighting a specific character is to just play as them myself and take some time to familiarize myself with their moveset and the flow of their combos. When I talk about it this way, there's already a lot to it, yet one of the most common complaints or even just neutral statements I've seen made in relation to this game in professional reviews is that the combat in Hyrule Warriors is just mindless button mashing. And I find this such a lazy observation. You can make pretty much any combat-based game about button mashing if you wanted to, from Smash Brothers to Street Fighter to God of War. And true, you can make it through chunks of the game by spamming the primary attack button over and over, and in fact I spent a lot of time doing just that on the Wii U version, as I played that much more casually. In the years between playing the original and this re-release though, something catastrophic happened to me. As I hinted to earlier, I became an avid MMO player, specifically of the combat-focused Elder Scrolls Online. When I recently got back into Hyrule Warriors, I put a lot of that MMO tryhard energy into sitting down and learning the ins and outs of the combat system. Frankly, I was amazed by how many things you can do within the game's combat. That's not to say that Hyrule Warriors has a combat system that requires complex inputs or dozens of hours of practice to master. Each string of attacks is pretty easy to execute. You press the regular attack button on your controller, which is Y by default. Then you can follow that up with more regular attacks for a string of like 6 or 7 basic attacks. Which, yes, you can do over and over, but this is hardly the most effective, let alone enjoyable way to play. Instead, you can follow up a regular attack with a strong attack, which is mapped to X by default. So you go Y and then X, and you have your first combo attack. You can then do the next combo by pressing the regular attack button twice and then hitting the strong attack. So YYX. The next combo is YYYX, and so forth. Each character typically has 5 of these combo attacks, although it can vary a bit per character. As some, such as Link, also allow you to do extra things by pressing the strong attack button multiple times during a combo attack. In addition to these easy to learn combos, you also have special attacks, which you can activate by simply pressing the A button. You have to fill up your special attack meter first, but you can do that automatically simply by defeating enemies. Special attacks are among the most powerful attacks, and each character has their own unique one. It may range from a powerful AoE attack that gets rid of the clutter of low-level enemies around you, to a conal attack that can turn the tide in a dueling situation. Lastly, there's what's called Focus Spirit, which temporarily infuses your character with powerful magic, increasing their damage and speed while reducing the knockback of enemy attacks. The Focus Spirit meter can be filled by picking up bottles of magic and then activated by pressing R. There's a lot of other cool stuff in the combat that's not really worth getting into for the purpose of this presentation. The reason I'm explaining all of this is because I want to illustrate that the basics of this game's combat are simple and easy to pick up, which can indeed fool you into thinking that it's all about that surface level button mashing. It's not the complexity of the inputs though that gives Hyrule Warriors its depth. It's how you can use all of these abilities in an optimized manner in order to pull off some really cool things. Juggle your enemies in the air, stun lock bosses, use items to separate powerful enemies from each other. It's so much more fun engaging with each enemy type when you have a good grasp on what you're doing. And we haven't even properly talked about the characters. Hyrule Warriors has a roster of 28 playable characters, most of which have appeared in one or more Zelda games, and then there's a small amount of original characters. Each character has their own unique moveset, which consists of the different combo attacks I just explained, as well as special attacks and some other traits unique to that character. Many characters have their own gimmicks that expand on their core movement. For example, Zelda can infuse her rapier with light, and she will do different light-based attacks until the 3 charges run out. Her alter ego Sheik, meanwhile, is able to play her harp, and based on the last combo attack you did, she will perform an ability based on that attack's element. So after she does her water-based combo attack, she can play her harp to summon a powerful water-based shield around her. After she does her lightning-based combo attack, she can play her harp to summon lightning around her, knocking back enemies that get too close to her. And so each element has its own ability tied to the harp. The layer of complexity varies per character, with some being more straightforward and button mash friendly, if you will, but it's this variety that makes it very hard for me to put this game down. Once I started to really get comfortable with the character and notice that I start going through the motions, I just pick up another character and totally change the way I play. It's also worth noting that while there are different iterations of the same character, for example you can play as regular Link, Toon Link and Young Link, they do have entirely different playstyles. It's not like in Smash Bros. Where you have clone characters who do more or less the same thing, such as Fox McCloud and Falco Lombardi. In Hyrule Warriors, the similarities are purely aesthetic for the most part. And the variety doesn't end there. Many characters have access to different weapon classes. Zelda can choose between a rapier, a baton, and the Dominion Rod, any one of which you can pick in order to make her lean towards the type of gameplay you desire. The rapier is good for dueling against powerful enemies, while the more AoE based approach of the baton is more convenient for getting rid of large swathes of trash mobs. I should note that you cannot switch between weapons during a battle, so you have to pick in advance based on what you think you'll need. Each weapon is also divided into 5 different tiers which you can unlock. Higher tiers will do the same attacks but are stronger and come with added bonuses. The number of different weapon styles varies per character. Link has a whopping 6 while others have just 1. But it's just to illustrate that while the total character roster is already at an impressive 29, the number of unique playstyles available to you is easily double that amount. Beyond feeding a ton of variety into a tight and consistent gameplay loop, the characters, like almost all other aspects of the game, are designed extremely well. Just using Ganondorf as an example, I think his design in Hyrule Warriors is the best we've seen in the game so far. But what, you say you prefer his look from Wind Waker? No problem, as you can unlock his outfit from that game in Hyrule Warriors, along with outfits that make him look like the Ganondorf from games like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess respectively. This principle applies to all recurring characters from the series, such as Zelda, Link and Impa. There are also characters who only appeared in one of the Zelda games, and their different costumes are more the standard palette swaps you'd expect. But still, the default character models themselves are such amazing tributes to the source material. Take Midna, the popular companion from the eponymous Zelda mainline game Twilight Princess, who is in Hyrule Warriors both in her cursed imp form and her true Twilight form. Mind you, in Twilight Princess, her true form was only seen in 2 cutscenes after the final boss battle. Yet here she is in full playable glory, complete with animations that reference different parts of Twilight Princess's story, such as the cannon she and Link use to enter the city in the sky, and the wolf she rides as an imp throughout most of the game. She even hums her own song during the victory screen, which is just a really cool touch. To give another example, we have Skull Kid, who served as the antagonist in the Nintendo 64 game Majora's Mask. In Hyrule Warriors, we see him represented by a, by Switch standards, highly detailed 3D model, accompanied by his fairies Tattle and Tail. And I didn't even notice it at first, but when I unlocked the second tier of Skull Kid's weapon, the so-called Lunar Ocarina, its in-game model also changed, going from the default ocarina that Link uses in Majora's Mask to a model that resembles the iconic moon in that game. It's completely inconsequential to the gameplay, and as said, it took me many hours before I even noticed it by accident. But it's little nods like these that add so much soul to the game. I could go on forever, as Skull Kid and Midna are just 2 examples out of many. Examples of characters that, mind you, many of us assumed we'd never see in another game again, except maybe as an Easter egg somewhere. Yet here they are, fully playable and designed in a way that pays so much respect to these characters. I also need to quickly mention the character model of Sheik, who in this game has a much more feminine design and truly looks like what she is: Princess Zelda in disguise. This grand approach, whereby some characters get a glow up and others get saved from being footnotes in Zelda history, is representative of the obsessive amount of detail that went into shaping the way this game looks, feels and sounds. So let's take an even closer look at the presentation to see how this approach affects other parts of the game. As we've already established, Hyrule Warriors is indeed a Dynasty Warriors game infused with Zelda charm. But don't let this premise fool you. I suspect that when Mr. Miyamoto told the team that the gameplay needed to be less Zelda, more Dynasty Warriors, the developers went the extra mile to cram as much Zelda into all remaining aspects of the game as they could get away with. Of course, there's the meticulously recreated characters and assets, and that adventure map modeled after the first Zelda game, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of familiar sound effects will activate those nostalgia neurons every single time, and there's even that signature animation and fanfare you get every time Link opens a chest in one of the Zelda games. Except they did a separate chest opening animation for every single character in Hyrule Warriors, in a way that fits their personality. Our vanilla hero Link opens a chest the regular way. The evil thief King Ganondorf violently plunders the chest as you'd expect him to do. The mischievous Skull Kid lets his fairies do the heavy lifting, and the small and impish Midna uses her enchanted hair to form a hand and reach into the chest. It's one of many examples of things they did not need to do but did anyway. I imagine this is why Team Ninja was put on the game alongside the Megaforce, and it works. Because once you start adding all these details up, it ends up contributing so much to the enjoyment and feel of the game. Though Zelda's influence is not just limited to the aesthetics of it all. Hyrule Warriors was, to my knowledge, the first time a Warriors game featured a targeting system that allowed you to focus on a specific enemy. This is no coincidence, since it was the monumental Zelda game, Ocarina of Time, that popularized an enemy lock-on system, which is known as Z-targeting in that franchise. The fact that they added this to Hyrule Warriors ends up having a pretty big impact on the gameplay, as it allows you to duel captains and generals even when they're surrounded by hordes of their minions. The same can be said of the aforementioned weakness gauge system, which allows you to exploit gaps in the enemy's defense, leading to more tactical and engaging fighting scenarios. One thing that really surprised me about the presentation of Hyrule Warriors is that it ended up borrowing so much from different eras of the Zelda franchise. If you're unfamiliar with The Legend of Zelda, one thing you should know about it is that the individual installments, while often sharing characters, story arcs and locations, can differ a lot from one another visually. The edgy Twilight Princess was the antithesis to the cartoony, cel-shaded world of Wind Waker. Skyward Sword was more of a compromise between these two extremes, and many of the handheld releases in the franchise each had their own unique vibe. Nearly all of the games that had been released up until 2014 ended up being represented in Hyrule Warriors in one way or the other, meaning that characters and locations from Wind Waker coexist with those from Ocarina of Time and Skyward Sword. In order to justify all of this, the story in this game creates circumstances under which all these realities or dimensions bleed into one another. It's frankly a ridiculous premise that is officially considered non-canon by Nintendo, and it does play out like some truly wild fanfiction that was written with the sole purpose of bringing these characters together. But you know, that's what I love about it. The story is over the top and nonsensical, but it does pull off the task of letting us enjoy playing as all of these wildly different characters. Different Zelda fans are attached to different games within the franchise, and through the way that developers approach Hyrule Warriors, nobody needs to feel left out just because the game and characters they grew up with ended up on the cutting room floor in the name of thematic consistency. The story and its presentation also adds something that you didn't really see in Nintendo games before. The characters are more edgy, more vocal, even if the dialogue is text only, and in some cases more sexualized. Yeah, it's original characters like Sia that really convinced me that Team Ninja had a lot to do with this part of the game, and I'm all here for it. Add to that the music, which ranges from sweeping symphonic pieces to 8-bit renditions of classic Zelda tunes. I especially love the main menu music, which is a dynamic orchestral arrangement of a mashup between the Zelda theme and the Hyrule Field theme, which changes depending on which part of the menu you're in. The songs that play during battles tend a bit more towards the metal side of the music spectrum. Some reviewers at the time complained about these occasionally cheesy reinterpretations of Zelda classics, but I think they're perfectly in line with the rest of the presentation. Bold, unapologetic and over the top, yet made out of passion for the source material. It encapsulates what makes this project work, an approach that's equal parts respectful and ridiculous. Of course, the game that is unfiltered Zelda devotion would feature a folk rock medley of Wind Waker tracks. I could talk about Hyrule Warriors for much longer and turn it into one of those brief summary of Skyrim videos that's like 5 hours long. But I don't want to torture you with that amount of commitment, much less myself, so it's about time we start wrapping this up. While playing this game, and even while writing this script, I thought about why this game specifically appeals to me so much. I'm not afraid to admit that for the longest time I could not really formulate why. After all, it's not like Hyrule Warriors exists so completely outside of the rest of the video game industry that there's nothing to compare it to. There are of course the other Musou games. And while I have played and enjoyed Dynasty Warriors games before and since experiencing Hyrule Warriors, none of them got its hooks in me quite like the Zelda crossover did. There's even comparable projects. I've mentioned Smash Bros. A couple of times already, and that's because that series does a lot of the things that Hyrule Warriors does too. It's a living tribute to many different games, the approach is also high effort and thorough, and there's enough content to keep you busy for hundreds of hours. And yet, while I like that franchise, I don't get nearly the mileage out of any given installment that I'm currently still getting out of Hyrule Warriors. But as I thought about it more, I identified a few key things which Hyrule Warriors does really well and which just work on me for whatever reason. The first is that it's a game with a tight gameplay loop that remains consistent throughout the entire playthrough. But within the margins of that gameplay loop, developers do a lot of different things to keep the experience from becoming stale, without hurting that consistency. A wacky story, tons of different characters to play with, a near endless amount of challenges. There's even a separate mode where you get to play as Ganon. In addition to adding the aforementioned variety needed to keep the gameplay fresh, it also adds a lot of optional depth to the way you play. So yeah, you can indeed just stick to playing as Link and keep mashing buttons, and you can even get pretty far in the game doing this. But the more you learn and understand about the combat, the more interesting it gets, and that's the true secret behind the title that remains interesting after that initial novelty wears off. The more you put into the game, the more it gives you back, and that's something you can't underestimate in an entertainment product. Another important feature of Hyrule Warriors is that it's, and I know this is a cliché, more than the sum of its parts. It's more than just Dynasty Warriors meets Zelda. These two franchises interact in a way where one benefits the other. I like Dynasty Warriors games, but I can't enjoy them as much as Hyrule Warriors, exactly because the Zelda elements have been incorporated so well, and with such eye to detail that I cannot see them as two separate things. Perhaps a third aspect is that Hyrule Warriors shouldn't work as well as it does, and that's always something I like in any piece of media. Its, for lack of a better term, ballsy approach is so out of left field in a Nintendo title. It still kind of amazes me that Nintendo even approved this game. They are notoriously protective of their IPs, and on the rare occasions they do hand over the keys to one of their franchises to another company, they tend to do it on their own strict terms. And Hyrule Warriors is too edgy, too sexy, too loud, and too anime for a Zelda spin-off. This feels like a fan game made with a AAA budget, like one of those mashup games you dream of as a kid. Wouldn't it be cool if they made this? But then they did. Funnily enough, in his interview with Nintendo Live, Zelda director Eiji Aonuma said that he was a bit worried when he'd read that many players said they preferred the cutscenes in Hyrule Warriors and wished they could see something as cool in a mainline Zelda game. This motivated him, and is likely the reason that the production value of the cutscenes in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the two Zelda games released since Hyrule Warriors, is a bit higher than what we had seen in the series up until that point. You see, Nintendo? It's okay to let your hair down once in a while. Who knows where it will take you? I remember way back in the day when GameSpot still scored games based on different categories. Most of these categories were the simple ones every gaming website at the time used, as well as those boring Steam user reviews today. Graphics, sound, replayability. But one of them stood out. It was a category simply called Tilt, which meant that X factor that some games have that you can't quite capture or attribute to a specific feature. Maybe that's my conclusion as well, that Hyrule Warriors just has that tilt factor. Is it perfect? Nah, not really, in as much as no game is perfect. The challenge modes like the boss rush and the Ganon mode are not as fun as the regular gameplay once the novelty wears off. And the My Fairy system, which gives you an admittedly very useful companion fairy in battle, was pretty hard for me to grasp without consulting resources outside of the game. Shout out to Warriors Dojo for explaining that one to me. Also, some of the giant bosses can get a bit stale when you have to do them over and over, like the ones against Manhandla or the Imprisoned. But overall, these are things I can just shrug off and not think about anymore as soon as I dive into the next challenge. If you like what you see and you have a Wii U, a 3DS or a Switch, I encourage you to give Hyrule Warriors a try. Admittedly, the Switch version is hands down the best one, but I can vouch for both other versions also being very, very good in their own right. I made this video because I feel like Hyrule Warriors is so much more than an okay 7 out of 10 novelty crossover that many reviews sort of implied it to be. Much more than a mindless button mashing simulator, it's an incredibly designed game that is well worth your time if you've got the stomach for it, and an effort that deserves to be remembered for its consistent quality. If you made it this far into the video, I thank you for watching this and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I do plan on doing these kinds of videos a lot more, so definitely stick around if that appeals to you. I hope to see you for the next one.